Speed of speciation. So when species are formed, sometimes it happens very, very slowly. So little changes build up over a long, 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 long time, and eventually maybe you'll get two different species formed. That's called the gradualism model. Sometimes, though, the fossil record shows that there's an organism that's around pretty much unchanged for a long, long time. And then um, pretty quickly on a geological time scale, you end up getting new species from that original species. And then they stay unchanged for a long, long time. That's called the punctuated equilibrium model because things stay the same and then boom, all of a sudden you get a brand new species. So let's look at both of them. Gradualism, species evolve slowly or gradually. So big changes occur, meaning you get two totally new species, so that's a big change, but that occurs because of the accumulation of many small changes. And then the opposite one is the punctuated equilibrium model. In the fossil record, many species appear as new forms rather suddenly in geological terms. They persist essentially unchanged and then disappear from the fossil record. So punctuated equilibrium means that species remain unchanged most of the time, that's this part, but evolve relatively quickly when the environment changes. So an environmental change might mean a new climate, maybe there's an ice age, or it could be new predators, maybe there's like a land bridge and new predators come over to your area or something. And then maybe pathogens, maybe a new virus has evolved, or maybe it's come along by a bird pooping near you or something. Okay, evolutionary timescales. These can be large or small. So we're going to look at two of them. One is macroevolution. These are long-term timescales, and these are events that create and destroy species. So, for example, an ice age, when it's very, very cold, all the warm weather species die, and the ones that are better adapted to the cold survive. And then at the end of the ice age, they tend to die off because they can't handle the more the warmer climate. The next, though, is microevolution, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time on in this video. These are short time scale events, so we're looking at generation to generation. So these are little time scale events that change the genotypes and phenotypes of populations. They change something called allele frequency. So most of you are familiar with the peppered moth example from the Industrial Revolution. So this is pre-Industrial Revolution, and so you see the peppered moth, and it can either be very dark, or I bet you can hardly even see this one, or it can be very light. And so in the pre-Industrial Revolution, the birds saw this one much more, and they ate it. And so this very light-colored one, maybe it's, I don't know if it's recessive or not, but let's assume it is. This is the one with the allele that would be around a lot more often, and this would be pretty rare. After the Industrial Revolution, though, the trees looked like this, and you can see how well the moth blends in. The darker moth blends in, but the lighter moth doesn't blend in much at all. And so this dark allele would be much more common in the population than the light allele at that point. So that's what we mean by allele frequency changing. How frequent is the recessive allele and how frequent is the dominant allele? Microevolution. Four things can change the allele frequencies in a population. So how often the light peppered moth is around or the dark peppered moth, for example. So the first is natural selection. That means if the environment is really dark, maybe the light one will be around more, or if the environment's really light, maybe the dark one will be around more. So natural selection tends to make a species more fit for its particular environment. Genetic drift means that little change, or means that a change can happen to a tiny population just by random chance. And that doesn't make the population better fit for the environment, it's just totally random. So we'll look at that. Gene flow, this is how often or how likely it is that one population can mate with members of another population. Is there a mountain between them or whatever? So that's gene flow. Gene flow says how often do alleles flow from one population to another? How often is there a mating between the two of them? And then the last one is mutation. So this is a random event that will change the population. Maybe it's a good mutation or a bad mutation. So we'll look at each of these. Natural selection is the only factor that generally adapts a population to its environment. So natural selection always favors the good traits for a particular environment. And this is really key. It's important that you think about it for a particular environment. There are some alleles that are better in some environments and some alleles that are better in other environments. So if you're a really speedy rabbit, maybe that's good if you have speedy predators. But if you're a rabbit that blends in better, maybe that's better in certain environments. The other three, genetic drift and gene flow and mutation, they can either be positive or negative or neutral. So let's look at those. Genetic drift occurs when changes in gene frequencies from one generation to another occur because of these random events, and it's really only affecting populations that are small, so that's important. They tend to not be important in large populations. So here's an example. We've got a very, very small wildflower population, only 10 organisms here. And so they mate and produce babies, and the next year the population looks, relatively the same. But let's say in this population, you've got a really bad drought and almost all of them die. These are the only two that survive. And they survive and reproduce, and all the babies then are red. So they didn't survive because red's any better. It was a tiny population. By chance, a couple of them survived, and by chance, they were red ones. And so that's what was left in the next generation. Another example is when you have this tiny population of bugs, and there's some brown ones and some green ones. Someone accidentally steps on the green ones. It's not that the green ones are bad for that environment, it's just that they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so what you have in the population is mainly brown ones at that point. Here's another example. These are the only sheep left on the planet. What a bummer, huh? That's so sad. Anyway, there are all these different sheep, and some are brown, and some are whitish, and some are kind of coffee colored, and some are darker brown. This one's gray. Let's say this one gets hit by lightning just by random chance. It's not that gray makes you more likely to get hit by lightning. It was just a random event. Because this population is so tiny, there happens to be no other gray ones. And so when that dies, there's no gray alleles, and it's eliminated from the population. So it's just random chance. So genetic drift occurs in small groups because if you have a big enough group, then more than one organism or more than a few organisms will have that allele. So for example, you wouldn't be too surprised if a coin produced 7 heads and 3 tails when you toss it 10 times. So 7 versus 3, that could happen. But if you tossed it 1,000 times and got 700 heads and 300 tails, you might think there's something wrong with the coin. So genetic drift can also occur as the result of two kind of special situations. One is called the bottleneck effect, and the other is called the founder effect. So here's the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect occurs when the numbers of individuals in a larger population are drastically reduced by a disaster. So here's a bottle, and it's showing organisms that are blue and white and yellow. Let's say it's a bunch of birds that live on an island, and a hurricane comes by and kills almost all of them. It kills all of them except a few blue ones and a white one. That means all the yellow ones are dead, so they are totally out of the population. And it didn't happen because of anything awful. I mean, it didn't happen because the yellow ones were worse suited for the environment. It happened because there was this awful hurricane, and it happened to kill almost every single organism. And so there they are. So by chance, some alleles may be eliminated just because everybody in the population died. An example of this happened with cheetahs. So the bottlenecking is really important for something called endangered species. I don't mean it's good for them. I mean it's something that happens sometimes with endangered species that makes their survival even less likely. So populations that have suffered bottleneck incidents have lost a lot of genetic diversity or a lot of genetic variation. So let's say there were 1,000 cheetahs around, and then they were hunted down, and we ended up with only 5 cheetahs. And then there was some laws put in place that you couldn't kill cheetahs, but you only started with these 5. And now let's say we're up to 500 or 1,000. But they're pretty much clones of each other because they all came from just the few 5 that you started with, even though there's a lot of them now. So even though there's more cheetahs, their genetic variation is so small that they could get wiped out if there's some new virus or something, because they're practically the same genetically. So this reduces their adaptability, and it makes it less likely that they're going to survive. So for example, the genetic variation in the 3 small wild populations of cheetahs is very low when compared with other mammals. Whoops. whoops. The founder effect, sorry about that. The founder effect occurs when a new population is started by only a few individuals that do not represent the gene pool of the larger population. So um, at an extreme, a population could be started by a single pregnant female or a single seed with only a tiny fraction of the genetic variation of the source population. So let's say you have a bird and it's pregnant and it gets blown by accident by a hurricane to a little island. Well, that bird has its baby and yikes, eventually maybe you'll have the whole island populated by these birds, but their genetic diversity will be very tiny because they were started by, this one pregnant female. The next one is called gene flow. This is a genetic exchange due to migration of fertile individuals or gametes between populations. By gametes, we could say that might mean like the pollen from one population is brought over to another population. Here's an example of green bugs and brown bugs, and gene flow means that one of the brown bugs is going to migrate over here, and so now you have the brown bug allele in that population. So gene flow tends to reduce the diversity between different populations, making them more likely to stay the same species. So here's an example. You've got a bunch of deer here and deer here. This is the eastern population and the western population. Here's the mountain pass, and some of the deer make it over here, and so that decreases the diversity between the two populations. Another example, if a wildflower population consists entirely of red flowers, like the one we were talking about earlier, but a white-flowered plant of the same species is nearby, and the pollen could be carried, the little r, the white pollen, could be carried to the red population. So that might mean you would eventually have white flowers here again. Gene flow tends to reduce differences between populations. The migration of people throughout the world is transferring alleles between populations that were once isolated, increasing gene flow in people. And so, for example, you end up having people whose ancestors evolved in different parts of the world. So Johnny Damon is an example of increased gene flow in the human population. And so I have a few people who have roots from people from different parts of the world. There's Barack. You might recognize some of these folks. I don't know. This is my favorite actor, Keanu Reeves. He's part Hawaiian, part Chinese, I want to say, and part Irish, I think. Maybe a few other things. Here's Halle Berry. She's probably the prettiest model from my generation. And Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston. Anyway, these folks, you might like their music. Let's see. This is a model that part Asian and part African, I think. I don't even know. Anyway, so who's that? Beyonce, maybe? Anyway, that shows some gene flow in the human population. Lastly, mutation. This is a change in an organism's DNA. So a new mutation in a gamete, it has to be in a gamete if it's going to affect the next generation, can immediately change the gene flow of a population. So an individual mutant allele may increase its relative frequencies over generations as a result of natural selection or genetic drift. Over the long term, mutation is very important to evolution because it's the original source of genetic variation. You got to put about 150 stars here because that's really important. The only way you ever get variation, you get it from having two parents and from, and from having independent assortment and crossing over, all that stuff in meiosis. But the original source of variation is always mutation. And this serves as the raw material for natural selection. If you had no variation in your population, then natural selection couldn't exist. Lastly, this doesn't really fit here, but I only have 2 minutes of this to do, so coevolution. That's when two species evolve together, each exerting a selective pressure on the other. And so the example, sorry.